There are photographs that slip through the cracks of history. Silent witnesses captured in silver halide and gelatin, stored in wooden crates, filed away in archives where dust settles like snow over forgotten mountains. They wait, patient, holding secrets that the living have not yet learned to see. In the spring of 1944, somewhere over the occupied coast of northern France, a reconnaissance pilot pushed his Spitfire through thin clouds at 30,000 feet, the air so cold it turned his breath to frost inside the cockpit. Below him, the earth spread like a vast chessboard, fields, forests, roads threading through villages that had learned to live in whispers. His cameras fired in sequence, mechanical shutters clicking in rapid succession, capturing strips of terrain that would be stitched together later by hands he would never meet. 5 cameras, each one capable of reading a man's shadow from 6 miles above. He did not know what he was photographing. That was not his job. His job was to fly straight, to hold altitude, to survive the thin air, and the possibility of Messerschmitts rising like angry hornets from fields below. When he landed, the film canisters were pulled from the belly of his aircraft and rushed to development. Negatives emerged in chemical baths, images surfacing like memories from dark water. They were catalogued, numbered, sent to RAF Medmenham, where photo interpreters worked in shifts around the clock, examining millions of frames for anything that might shift the balance of an increasingly desperate war. The photograph in question, later designated Frame 4024B, showed a stretch of coastline near a small French village whose name would not matter for another 60 years. In 1944, it was examined quickly. The interpreters, mostly women recruited from universities and film studios, looked for the obvious threats: gun emplacements, troop movements, the skeletal frameworks of radar installations. They found none. The frame showed hedgerows, a dirt road cutting diagonally across farmland, the geometric shadows of stone walls. Ordinary, unremarkable. It was filed away with thousands of others, deemed insignificant in the great machinery of Allied intelligence that was then preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 80% of British intelligence came from photographic reconnaissance. Every beach of Normandy had been mapped, every bunker measured, every German strongpoint identified through the stereoscopic analysis that made flat images rise into 3 dimensions. But Frame 4024B offered nothing to that effort. So it slept. In the archives, time moved differently. Decades passed in the space between one viewing and the next. The war ended. The veterans aged. The Spitfires that had flown those missions were scrapped or placed in museums, their pale blue camouflage fading under fluorescent lights. The photographs remained, 10 million of them stored in Edinburgh, a visual record of a continent at war, waiting for questions that had not yet been asked. It was not until the early 2000s that Frame 4024B was pulled from storage again. A team of historians working on a documentary about Operation Crossbow, the Allied effort to identify and destroy Hitler's V-weapon sites, had requested access to reconnaissance images from the spring of 1944. They were searching for evidence of launch ramps, the distinctive ski-shaped structures that held V-1 rockets before they were fired toward London. Frame 4024B was among hundreds delivered to them on high-resolution scans, digital resurrections of analog ghosts. At first, it seemed as unremarkable as it had 60 years prior, but one researcher, a woman with a background in landscape archaeology, noticed something, not in the foreground, where the eye naturally fell, but in the periphery. In the corner of the frame, barely visible among the shadows of hedgerows, there were marks in the field. Subtle disturbances in the earth that formed a pattern. She enhanced the image, increased the contrast, adjusted the brightness until the marks became clearer. Lines, rectangular outlines, the unmistakable signature of recent excavation, but not bomb craters. Too regular, too deliberate. She reached for her stereoscope, the same simple tool that photo interpreters had used during the war, and placed Frame 4024B alongside the adjacent frame from the same flight path. When viewed together, overlapping by 60%, the 2-dimensional images became 3-dimensional, and suddenly she could see depth. The marks in the field were not surface disturbances. They were trenches, freshly dug, covered with camouflage netting that had been carefully arranged to mimic the texture of farmland from above. Her pulse quickened. She pulled more frames from the sequence, expanding her view of the area. The trenches formed a network, connecting to what appeared to be a small structure half buried in the earth near the tree line. The structure had a flat roof covered in soil and vegetation, designed to be invisible from the air. But the excavation around it had left telltale scars, shadows that fell at angles inconsistent with natural topography. She measured the dimensions using photogrammetric software, the modern descendant of the wild A6 machines that had been smuggled from Switzerland through Nazi Germany in 1943 to analyze Hitler's rocket program. The structure was approximately 12 meters long, 4 meters wide. The trenches radiated outward in a spoke pattern, each one terminating at a small circular depression. Storage bunkers, perhaps, or launch positions. She cross-referenced the location with known V1 sites identified during Operation Crossbow. It did not match. The ski ramps were absent. The proportions were wrong. This was something else. Something the photo interpreters of 1944 had not been trained to recognize because it did not yet exist in their catalog of threats. She began pulling reconnaissance images from the weeks following frame 4024B, tracking the site's development over time. In subsequent flights, the trenches had been filled. The structure remained, but now there were vehicles nearby. Trucks, perhaps, though their shapes were indistinct. And then, in a frame from late May 1944, just days before D-Day, she saw it, a shadow, long and cylindrical, lying near the entrance to the buried structure, too large to be a V1, too streamlined, and beside it, barely visible in the grainy resolution of wartime photography, human figures, men working, preparing something that British intelligence had missed. She printed the images and laid them across her desk in chronological sequence. April, May, early June. A story unfolded in monochrome, told in gradients of gray. The site had been constructed rapidly, under cover of hedgerows and camouflage in the weeks leading up to the Allied invasion. It had been photographed repeatedly, not because it was targeted, but because reconnaissance flights followed pre-planned routes, photographing everything beneath them without discrimination. The cameras had seen, but the human eye, burdened with the urgency of immediate threats, had looked past it. Now, decades later, with the pressure of war lifted and the luxury of hindsight available, the pattern became clear. This was not a launch site for V1 rockets. The orientation was wrong. The infrastructure did not match, but it was a launch site for something. She consulted with weapons historians, specialists in German rocket development. They examined the images, measured the dimensions of the shadow in the May photograph, calculated probable payloads based on the size of the support structures. Their conclusion was startling. The site matched the configuration of test facilities for an experimental weapon, possibly a prototype of the V2 rocket, or perhaps something even more obscure, one of the dozens of Wunderwaffen projects that had consumed German resources in the final years of the war. But if that were true, why was it positioned in northern France within range of Allied bombers? Why not in Germany, where the V2 program was centered? Unless it was not meant to be permanent. Unless it was a forward deployment, a desperate gambit to strike Allied staging areas before the invasion could be launched. A secret plan, hidden in plain sight, captured by a camera that did not know what it was seeing. The researcher compiled her findings into a report and submitted it to the Ministry of Defense. Within weeks, she received a response. Classified documents from 1944 were declassified in light of her discovery. What emerged was a story that had been buried not just in archives, but in the deliberate silence of wartime secrecy and post-war discretion. In March 1944, British signals intelligence had intercepted fragmentary communications from German forces in northern France. The messages were encoded, but the pattern suggested increased activity related to weapons development. The intercepts mentioned a program codenamed Adlerschlag, Eagle Strike. Details were scarce. The Germans were careful, their communications discipline tight. But the British War Office was concerned enough to increase reconnaissance flights over suspected sites. Frame 4024B was part of that effort. The problem was scale. In the spring of 1944, RAF Medmenham was processing 85,000 images daily in preparation for D-Day. Photo interpreters worked in shifts, their eyes burning from hours bent over stereoscopes, searching for gun emplacements, minefields, barbed wire, the immediate tactical threats that would face soldiers on the beaches. Long-term strategic weapons programs, while important, were secondary to the survival of Operation Overlord. The V1 and V2 programs had been identified and were being targeted through Operation Crossbow. Anything that did not fit the known profiles was set aside for future analysis. Future came and went. The invasion succeeded. German forces retreated. The site in frame 4024B was overrun by advancing Allied troops in late June 1944, just weeks after the photograph was taken. By the time intelligence officers arrived to inspect it, the structure had been demolished. The trenches filled. The equipment removed. Only scorched earth remained and locals who claimed ignorance of what had been there. The demolition was thorough. Too thorough. The Germans in their retreat had taken time, precious time as Allied forces closed in, to erase all evidence of what had been constructed there. This suggested significance beyond a simple munitions depot or supply cache. It suggested something worth hiding even in defeat. Post-war interrogations of German personnel yielded little. Those who might have known were either dead or unwilling to speak, or had successfully disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. The paper trail was similarly sparse. German military records from that period were fragmented, destroyed in the final bombing campaigns or deliberately purged. What references existed to Adlerschlag were vague, couched in euphemisms and administrative language that revealed nothing of substance. For decades it remained a historical footnote, an unfinished mystery, a question mark in the margins of a much larger narrative, until frame 4024B was rediscovered and its details brought into focus. The researchers' analysis prompted a broader investigation. Archival teams in Britain, France, and Germany began cross-referencing documents, looking for any mention of the site or the Adlerschlag program. In a vault in Freiburg, a collection of Luftwaffe records yielded a logistics manifest dated April 1944, listing the transport of specialized equipment to a location in northern France. The coordinates matched frame 4024B. The manifest did not specify what the equipment was, but it noted the involvement of personnel from Peenemünde, the German rocket research facility where the V2 had been developed. This was the first concrete link. Peenemünde was the heart of Germany's rocket program, a sprawling complex on the Baltic coast where engineers under Werner von Braun had created weapons that could strike London from 200 miles away. After RAF bombing raids in August 1943 crippled the facility, production had been moved underground to factories in central Germany. But research continued, and dozens of experimental designs were tested alongside the V2. Many never made it past the prototype stage. Some were too ambitious. Some were too expensive. Some simply did not work. But the presence of Peenemünde personnel in northern France suggested that whatever Adlerschlag involved, it was connected to the cutting edge of German weapons technology. The researcher traveled to Germany to interview retired aerospace engineers, men who had been young technicians at Peenemünde during the war. Most were reluctant to speak. The V2 program had been built on the backs of slave labor from concentration camps, and the moral weight of that knowledge sat heavily on those who had survived into old age. But one engineer, a man in his late 80s who had worked in the guidance systems division, agreed to talk. He did not remember Adlerschlag by name, but when shown the photographs from frame 4024B, his expression changed. He recognized the configuration. In early 1944, he said, there had been a project, short-lived, highly classified, to develop a mobile rocket platform. The idea was to create a launch system that could be rapidly deployed and concealed, avoiding the vulnerability of fixed installations like the V1 ramps that were being destroyed by Allied bombing. The system used a smaller rocket, less powerful than the V2, but with a range sufficient to strike targets in southern England from northern France. The advantage was mobility. It could be set up, fired, and dismantled within hours. It was meant to be used in the event of an Allied invasion, targeting command centers, supply depots, and troop concentrations before they could be established. The project, he said, had been canceled, or so he had been told. Resources were diverted to the V2 production, which was seen as more promising. The mobile platform was shelved. But now, looking at the photographs, he wondered if it had been shelved or simply moved. Classified beyond his clearance. Tested in secret while the official record claimed it no longer existed. He could not be certain. Memory, after so many years, was unreliable. But the structures in the photograph matched what he remembered from the design schematics. The buried control bunker, the radial launch positions, even the dimensions of the shadow, what the researcher had identified as a possible rocket, aligned with the specifications of the mobile platform he had worked on in 1944. If this was true, then Frame 4024B had captured something extraordinary. Not just a secret weapon, but a secret plan. A contingency operation that the Germans had prepared in case the invasion came. A plan to strike Allied forces as they landed, using weapons that had been hidden so effectively that even the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in history had failed to find them until decades after the war ended. The implications were staggering. If Adlerschlag had been operational in June 1944, it could have changed the course of D-Day. Not enough to stop the invasion, the Allies had overwhelming force, but enough to inflict casualties that might have altered the timeline, delayed the liberation of France, prolonged the war. The fact that it had not been used suggested either that it was not ready in time, or that it had been destroyed before it could be deployed. Either way, the site had been photographed, catalogued, and ignored, its significance invisible to the eyes that needed to see it most. The researcher returned to the archives with renewed focus. If Frame 4024B had captured Adlerschlag, there might be other sites, other photographs that had been overlooked. She requested access to reconnaissance imagery from the entire northern coast of France, covering the weeks leading up to D-Day. The archivist delivered crates of film reels and digital scans, terabytes of data representing millions of images. She enlisted colleagues, historians, archaeologists, image analysts, and together they began a systematic review. They developed search parameters based on the features identified in Frame 4024B. Buried structures with flat camouflaged roofs, radial trench systems, recent excavation near tree lines or hedgerows. They used modern machine learning algorithms to scan the images, flagging anything that matched the profile. The computer did in hours what would have taken years by hand, and it found patterns. Over the course of several months, they identified 17 additional sites along the French coast that exhibited similar characteristics. Not all were identical. Some were larger, some smaller, some had different configurations, but all shared the core elements of concealed infrastructure and recent construction in the spring of 1944. 17 sites, each one photographed during reconnaissance missions, each one overlooked. When plotted on a map, the sites formed a defensive arc along the anticipated invasion coastline, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against any landing force. It was a network. A system. Not a single experimental weapon, but a coordinated deployment. The team cross-referenced the sites with known German military positions and found something troubling. Many of the Adlerschlag locations were not near major troop concentrations or fortifications. They were isolated, deliberately separated from regular Wehrmacht units. This suggested operational security beyond normal military practice. The Germans had not trusted their own forces with knowledge of what was being built. Only specialized personnel from Peenemünde and select SS units had been involved. This level of compartmentalization was unusual, even by the standards of Nazi secrecy. It implied that Adlerschlag was more than a weapons program. It was a strategic gambit that Hitler himself might have authorized, kept hidden from all but the highest levels of command. Further archival research uncovered a memo from British intelligence dated July 1944, after the invasion. It referenced captured German documents that mentioned unspecified rocket equipment abandoned in northern France. The memo noted that investigation teams had found remnants of launch infrastructure, but no rockets or warheads. The conclusion at the time was that the sites had been decoys, part of a deception operation to distract Allied intelligence from real V-weapon facilities. The memo recommended no further action. It was filed and forgotten. But in light of the photographic evidence, the memo took on new meaning. The sites were not decoys. They were operational, or nearly so. The rockets had been removed before the Allies could capture them, likely transported back to Germany, or destroyed to prevent their technology from falling into enemy hands. The infrastructure remained because it could not be moved quickly enough, and the Germans had gambled that its purpose would not be understood without the weapons themselves. The researcher published her findings in a military history journal. The article, titled "Eagle Strike: Hidden Rocket Sites in Occupied France and the Intelligence Failure of 1944, generated immediate controversy. Some historians praised the work, calling it a significant contribution to understanding German weapons development and Allied reconnaissance. Others were skeptical, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that the structures in the photographs could have been decoys or storage facilities unrelated to rockets. The debate was vigorous and, in academic terms, heated. What was not debatable was the photograph itself. Frame 4024B existed. The site existed. The pattern of 17 similar sites existed. The question was interpretation, what those sites represented and whether their discovery decades after the fact constituted a meaningful revision of World War II history, or simply an interesting footnote to an already exhaustive body of knowledge. For the researcher, the answer was clear. The sites were real. Adlerschlag had been real, and the fact that it had been captured in reconnaissance photographs but not recognized was a testament to the limits of human perception under pressure. The photo interpreters at RAF Medmenham had been brilliant, their work essential to Allied victory. But they had been overwhelmed by volume, constrained by time, and focused on known threats. The unknown, even when photographed in exquisite detail, had remained invisible. In 2008, the researcher led a ground expedition to the site of frame 4024B. The French landowner, a farmer whose family had worked the land for generations, granted permission for an archaeological survey. Using ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors, the team scanned the field where the buried structure had been. They found anomalies, subsurface voids consistent with filled trenches, concrete fragments buried a meter below the surface, rusted metal debris, steel rebar, corroded bolts, pieces of machinery too degraded to identify with certainty, but clearly industrial in origin. The discoveries confirmed that construction had taken place, that something substantial had been built and then removed or destroyed. The team excavated a small test trench, revealing the remnants of a concrete foundation. The dimensions matched the structure visible in frame 4024B. Chemical analysis of soil samples found traces of propellant residue, compounds consistent with the fuel used in German rockets. It was not definitive proof that a rocket had been launched, but it was evidence that rocket fuel had been present. Combined with the photographic record and the archival documents, it painted a compelling picture. Adlerschlag had been here, a mobile rocket platform, designed to strike Allied forces during the invasion, hidden so effectively that it had escaped detection until long after the war. The farmer watching the excavation mentioned that his grandfather had told stories about the Germans, how they had come in the spring of 1944 with trucks and machinery working at night, how the villagers had been ordered to stay indoors, threatened with reprisals if they spoke of what they saw, and then after the invasion the Germans had returned briefly, dismantled everything and left. The grandfather had assumed it was a munitions depot. He had never imagined it could be anything more. The question that haunted the researcher was not what Adlerschlag had been, but what it might have done. If the 17 sites had been operational on June 6, 1944, and if each had been capable of launching even a handful of rockets toward the landing beaches, the impact could have been catastrophic. Not in terms of stopping the invasion. The Allied advantage in numbers and material was overwhelming, but in terms of casualties and chaos. The beaches on D-Day were crowded with men, equipment, and supplies. Thousands of soldiers wading through surf, exposed and vulnerable. A single rocket striking a landing craft could kill dozens. A barrage could kill hundreds. More than the immediate death toll, the psychological effect would have been devastating. Allied troops had been trained to expect artillery, machine guns, and mortars. They had not been prepared for guided missiles falling from the sky. The terror of the V-1 and V-2 attacks on London was well documented. The sound of the engines cutting out, the silence before impact, the helplessness of knowing you could not defend against them. On a beach, under fire, that terror would have been magnified. Panic could have spread. Units could have broken. The carefully orchestrated timetable of the invasion could have collapsed into confusion. And yet, it had not happened. The rockets, if they existed, had not been fired. Why? The researcher found a possible answer in German military records from late May 1944. A report from the Wehrmacht commander in northern France noted that specialized equipment being transported to coastal positions had been delayed due to Allied bombing of rail lines. Another report mentioned shortages of fuel and technical personnel due to losses on the Eastern Front. A third referenced orders from Berlin to prioritize V-2 production over all other projects. The picture that emerged was one of bureaucratic dysfunction and logistical collapse. Adlerschlag, like so many late-war German projects, had been ambitious in conception, but undermined by the realities of a nation losing the war. The rockets might have been built. The launch sites might have been prepared, but the two had never come together at the right time and place. There was also the possibility, raised by military analysts who reviewed the findings, that Allied intelligence had known more than the official record suggested. The sudden increase in reconnaissance flights over northern France in the spring of 1944 had been attributed to D-Day planning, but perhaps there had been another motive. Perhaps signals intelligence had picked up enough about Adlerschlag to prompt targeted surveillance, even if the photo interpreters had not recognized what they were seeing. Perhaps the sites had been bombed preemptively under cover of the broader air campaign against V-weapon facilities, and the destruction attributed to general disruption rather than a specific countermeasure. If so, the secret had been kept even from the historical record. A hidden victory, unacknowledged because to acknowledge it would have required revealing intelligence sources and methods that remained sensitive decades later. The researcher requested access to classified files from MI6 and the CIA, agencies that had inherited wartime intelligence archives. Both denied the requests, citing national security. The denials were form letters, polite and bureaucratic, offering no specifics. But the fact that they had been issued at all, more than 60 years after the war, suggested that something about Adlerschlag remained sensitive, or perhaps it was simply policy. Deny all requests for classified material, regardless of content, to avoid setting precedents. The researcher could not know. The wall of secrecy that had protected Allied intelligence during the war still stood in places, even as veterans died, and the living memory of the conflict faded into history. What she could know was what the photographs revealed, and what they revealed was a lesson about seeing and not seeing. Frame 40-4B had been examined by trained experts in 1944, people whose job was to find hidden threats. They had looked at it and seen nothing. Not because they were incompetent, but because they were human. Because attention is finite and threats are many. Because the mind sees what it expects to see and filters out the rest. The camera, by contrast, sees everything, indiscriminately, without judgment or priority. It captures light and shadow, records texture and shape, freezes moments in silver and chemistry. The photograph does not care what is important. It simply is. And decades later, when the pressure of war has lifted and new eyes examine the image with new questions, the photograph yields its secrets. Not because anything has changed in the image itself, but because the viewer has changed. The context has shifted. The tools have improved. And what was once invisible becomes clear. This is the paradox of reconnaissance. The most valuable intelligence is often the intelligence you do not know you have. The photograph that seems insignificant in the moment may be the key to understanding a threat you have not yet recognized. But you cannot study everything. You cannot treat every image as if it might hide a secret plan. Resources are limited. Time is limited. Attention is limited. So choices are made. Priorities are set. And some things slip through. Frame 40-4B slipped through in 1944. It was filed, stored, and forgotten. But it waited. Because photographs are patient. They do not decay as memories do. They do not distort with time. They remain silent witnesses until someone asks the right question. The researchers' work on Adlerschlag led to a broader initiative to digitize and reanalyze World War II reconnaissance photography using modern technology. The 10 million images stored in Edinburgh were scanned at high resolution and uploaded to databases accessible to researchers worldwide. Machine learning algorithms were trained to identify features of interest, fortifications, vehicles, camouflage patterns, and flag them for human review. The project, funded by a consortium of universities and historical societies, was called Operation Hindsight. Its goal was not to rewrite history, but to deepen understanding, to find the details that had been missed in the urgency of war, and to honor the work of the men and women who had created the photographs by ensuring that their efforts continued to yield knowledge decades after their original purpose had been fulfilled. Within the first year, Operation Hindsight uncovered dozens of previously unidentified sites across Europe. Some were minor, supply depots, temporary encampments, training areas. But others were significant. A hidden airfield in Poland that had been used to test experimental aircraft, a network of underground bunkers in Norway that appeared to be part of a never-completed fortress system, a shipyard in occupied Denmark, where U-boats had been assembled under camouflage netting so effective that Allied bombers had never targeted it. Each discovery was a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the vast and complex machinery of the Second World War that had operated in shadows and secrecy. And each discovery began with a photograph, an image captured by a pilot who did not know what he was seeing, analyzed by interpreters who did not have time to look deeper, and stored in an archive where it waited for someone to ask the right question. The work also revealed the extraordinary skill of the photo interpreters who had worked at RAF Medmenham and similar facilities during the war. The volume of images they had processed was staggering, 85,000 per day at the peak of D-Day preparations. And yet, they had identified the vast majority of critical threats. The V-1 launch sites, 96 of them, found through painstaking analysis. The V-2 test facilities at Peenemünde, measured with such precision that scale models could be built for targeting purposes. The fortifications along the Atlantic Wall, mapped in such detail that every platoon commander on D-Day had accurate intelligence about the defenses they would face. The fact that a few sites, like Adlerschlag, had been missed did not diminish that achievement. It underscored the scale of what they had accomplished under impossible conditions. Working in shifts, eyes burning, backs aching, they had bent over stereoscopes and brought a continent into focus. They had turned photographs into intelligence and intelligence into action. They had saved lives. They had shortened the war. And they had done it with tools that seem primitive by modern standards: simple magnifying glasses and overlapping images, chemical baths and manual catalogs. No computers, no algorithms, just human perception, trained and disciplined, applied with relentless focus. The researcher, reflecting on her years working with the photographs, often thought about the pilot who had taken frame 4024B. She did not know his name. The mission logs had recorded his flight path and altitude, but not his identity. He might have survived the war, lived a long life, died peacefully in his sleep, never knowing that the photograph he had taken in the spring of 1944 would be scrutinized 70 years later and reveal a secret that had eluded his contemporaries. Or he might have been shot down on a later mission, his Spitfire falling into the Channel or disintegrating over occupied Europe, another casualty in a war that consumed millions. Either way, he had done his job. He had flown into the cold, hostile sky and brought back images that would outlive him. That was the nature of reconnaissance. The individual mission was often insignificant, part of a vast and repetitive effort. But cumulatively, over thousands of missions, the photographs built a picture of the enemy's world. They stripped away secrecy. They turned the hidden into the visible. And sometimes they preserved knowledge that would not be understood until long after the moment had passed. Frame 4024B was one moment among millions. One frame in an endless sequence of images that documented a continent at war. But it mattered. Because history is made not just of great events and famous names, but of small details noticed by careful eyes. A shadow in a field, a disturbance in the earth, a pattern that does not belong. These are the fragments from which understanding is built. In the end, the story of Frame 4024B is not a story about what was missed. It is a story about what was found, about patience and persistence, about the willingness to look at old things with new eyes and ask questions that others have stopped asking. It is a story about the enduring power of photography, not as art, though it can be that, but as evidence, as testimony, as a record of reality that transcends the limitations of memory and survives the death of those who created it. The photograph waits. It does not demand attention. It does not insist on its own importance. It simply exists, holding its secrets with the stillness of silver halide suspended in gelatin, until someone looks closely enough to see. And when that moment comes, when the light falls right, when the context aligns, when the question is finally asked, the photograph speaks. It reveals what it has been holding all along, not because anything has changed in the image, but because the viewer has learned to see. This is the legacy of reconnaissance. This is the lesson of frame 4024B. That seeing is not a passive act, but an active engagement with the world. That knowledge does not come easily or all at once, but accumulates through attention and effort, and that the past, though fixed in time, is not fixed in understanding. It remains open to interpretation, to discovery, to revelation. As long as there are photographs to examine and minds willing to examine them, history will continue to yield its secrets, one frame at a time, one detail at a time, until the invisible becomes visible and the hidden comes to light. Perhaps the most profound revelation was not about the past, but about the present. In an age of satellite surveillance and digital imaging, where nations monitor each other with technologies that can read license plates from orbit, the lesson of frame 4024B remained relevant. The tools of observation have evolved beyond recognition, but the challenge of interpretation has not. The volume of data collected by modern intelligence agencies dwarfs what RAF Medmenham processed during the entire war. Thousands of images per second, streaming from satellites and drones, processed by algorithms designed to flag anomalies and patterns. Yet the fundamental problem persists: how to distinguish signal from noise, how to recognize threats that do not fit known profiles, how to see what you are not looking for. The Adlerschlag sites had been photographed repeatedly in 1944, captured with remarkable clarity by cameras that performed exactly as designed. But they had not been understood, because understanding requires more than seeing. It requires context, knowledge, imagination, the ability to conceive of possibilities that have not yet been proven. In 1944, mobile rocket platforms hidden in hedgerows were beyond the conceptual framework of Allied intelligence. Today, new threats emerge that challenge current frameworks in similar ways. And somewhere, in the vast archives of surveillance data accumulating in secure facilities around the world, there may be photographs like frame 4024B, images that will seem unremarkable until someone, years from now, asks a question no one thought to ask, and discovers that the answer was visible all along, waiting patiently in the light and shadow of a single frozen moment. The story does not end with discovery. It begins there. Because every answer opens new questions, every revealed secret points toward others still hidden. The 17 sites identified along the French coast were only the beginning. As Operation Hindsight expanded its analysis to other theaters of war, similar patterns emerged. In the Netherlands, aerial photographs from late 1944 showed what appeared to be launching positions for V-2 rockets that had never been documented in Allied intelligence reports. In Poland, hidden airstrips emerged from forest canopies when images were processed with modern contrast enhancement. In Norway, coastal fortifications revealed themselves to be far more extensive than wartime assessments had indicated, suggesting that the Wehrmacht had anticipated an Allied invasion from the north that never came. Each photograph was a time capsule, preserving not just what was visible on the surface but what lay beneath: the intentions, the fears, the strategies of an enemy, fighting a war on multiple fronts with dwindling resources and growing desperation. The cameras had recorded it all, indifferent to significance, capturing everything that fell within their field of view. And now, decades later, that indifference had become invaluable. Because the photograph does not lie about what it did not know to look for.